Hi, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 8. This is the last new lecture of material that I will release and record before the midterm exam, and I would like to apologize for getting this put up on the late side. I have had a bit of a busy day. But assuming that you're otherwise caught up on the lectures and any assigned material from previous weeks, once you have studied this lecture and watched the relevant clip of March of the Penguins, you are ready to take the midterm exam. Oh, pardon me. The last lecture ended with a short summary of the very sparse terrestrial biodiversity we still have in Antarctica, the life that survives living on land even after the opening of gateways and the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. Today, we're going to be delving much more into Antarctica's marine life, beginning with some introductory ecology. So the first half of this lecture focuses more on ecology, food webs, and relations between animals. The second half, organisms, not animals, excuse me. The second half focuses more on some of the particular members of the Antarctic community, like penguins, whales, seals, and the like. So the midterm is actually open now. I don't recommend you take it until you've finished watching this, but it will be open until Sunday, February 7th at 11:59 p.m. So once you begin your attempt at the exam, you have 75 minutes to answer 50 multiple choice and true or false questions. This time, there are no short answer questions. So there is a review session that occurred on today, summarizing last week's material and including a little bit of exam review, and that is up and posted now. On Wednesday, February 3rd, I will be releasing lecture 9, which is recap and review. And I think what I'm going to do actually is put the slides up in the morning, and then I am going to just present it during office hours and record that. So there will be a review lecture that I will record, and I'm going to do one of the only live recordings I do this course, basically. I'll be going through the review lecture on Wednesday during office hours and recording that and then posting that as lecture 9. But I will put up the slides much earlier. So the plan is for this to be open until Sunday. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a sec. And one thing I want to mention is that the exam is just one part of the class. The exams in total are 35% of your grade. Each exam is thus 17.5% of your grade. That's not trivial, but it's also not everything. So the midterm isn't going to make or break everything. Hopefully you've also been talking to the TAs and submitting your labs, and we've had one quiz so far, and there's the reading assignment coming up as well. But there's other work that isn't just the test. So if that helps you feel a little bit better about test anxiety, then that fact is there. Not as much of your grade depends on just the midterm as you might think. But either way, in terms of other things we have going on right now, there is a lab due this week, lab number 4, Rocks of Antarctica, and there is some material in last week's lectures, particularly in the first half of lecture 6, that might be useful reference for that. But the TAs also have an excellent presentation. And the news article reading assignment is due the Sunday after the midterm on Sunday, February 14th. But it is open now. You can see it under week 6 glaciers, so you are welcome to start on that. It's something you can do if you end up finishing the exam on the early side and have extra time, or have some time to get some things out of the way. I also wanted to mention there is one possible extra credit opportunity this Thursday. Our department is having another visiting lecturer come and talk during colloquium. She's actually a visiting professor from the University of Colorado Boulder, and she is a researcher in Native American and Indigenous studies, and she's doing a talk on land stewardship, which is something us geologists definitely need to consider more. So that is happening this Thursday, and the Zoom link is there. I will have info on another extra credit opportunity coming up. I wanted to mention that to those who have submitted already, I will add the points after your midterm grade, after your midterm is submitted. And yes, you do send the extra credit assignments straight to me. I hold on to those and I add them afterwards. So if you're wondering about that. So here's today's material. We will cover the ecology of Antarctica, the marine ecology, excuse me. So talking about food webs, trophic levels, and energy consumption at different trophic levels, and also some peculiarities of Antarctica's ecosystems that, well, are not found in too many places other than Antarctica, like the fact that sea ice plays such a prominent role, and the fact that, well, sunlight is only present for part of the year, so that leads to an interesting pattern in when there's a lot of feeding, basically. We'll get to that. And then the second half of the lecture goes through individual organisms like krill, penguins, and whales. And that's after we've kind of introduced some broader concepts about what the Antarctic marine ecosystem is actually like. So one of the first distinctions we can make with different living organisms is how they obtain hydrocarbons, which are fundamentally sugars. All life on Earth is carbon-based life, and at some level, all life on Earth depends on hydrocarbons to obtain energy. And some organisms can make hydrocarbons themselves, and those are known as autotrophs. Auto means self, and kind of like an automobile moves itself, although not really. And troph means eat. I at one point thought the word trough was pronounced troph because I had trouble pronouncing things when I was little. And that association actually helps me with this because troph kind of sounds like a mispronunciation of feeding trough. So it's about eating. And autotrophs are plants and other photosynthetic organisms, and the handful of extremophiles that use chemical energy. And generally, autotrophs don't need to consume other organisms to make energy. Carnivorous plants are an interesting exception. They do that because the soil they grow in lacks nutrients, and eating bugs gives them some essential nutrients. But in general, they get their hydrocarbons from photosynthesis. Or in the case of some extremophiles, they get energy from reactions with inorganic chemicals. Now, we cannot do this. We and all other animals and fungi, and honestly, even most microorganisms are considered to be heterotrophs, which means they have to eat something else to survive. And hetero is, well, that explains itself. So the point of this is that not everything can make its own food. A lot of organisms depend on the organisms that can make their own food to survive. And that's a fancy way, in our particular case, as humans, that's a fancy way of saying we need plants to survive. We eat plants and we eat animals that also eat the plants. Pardon me, I am fine, just been a long day. In its simplest explanation, hydrocarbons are synthesized inside of the cells of plants or other photosynthetic organisms. And something you want to remember is that in plants actually have a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are actually the chloroplasts that do the photosynthesis, which is kind of cool. But the hydrocarbons are synthesized from carbon dioxide and from water. And oxygen is actually produced by photosynthesis as a waste product. So those cyanobacteria that helped oxygenate the atmosphere to begin with were fundamentally producing waste. But something that I forget frequently and that is easy to forget is that plants need to process the energy. Plants need to convert the sugars into energy, and plants do need oxygen to do that. Plants and heterotrophs, in fact, we do this. We perform the process called cell respiration, which is when we or plants or whatever other organism is processing and eating the hydrocarbons stored. And we use oxygen to do this. That's why it's known as aerobic cell respiration. And all but a very small handful of extremophiles, all living organisms use aerobic cell respiration to obtain energy from hydrocarbons. And really, it's only a few extremophiles that can't, and that kind of ties back into how there wasn't much complex life that existed before cyanobacteria introduced oxygen into the atmosphere. we only start seeing a lot of fossils of complex multicellular organisms once there's oxygen, once there's in fact a significant amount of oxygen. Everything except for those extremophiles is descended from common ancestors that needed oxygen to survive. Now, most autotrophs use photosynthesis, and when I tell people when people ask me why the dinosaur extinction was so devastating, I tell people that it had a lot to do with sunlight. Very little very little life on Earth can survive without the sun. Plants and other photosynthetic organisms like cyanobacteria or the phytoplankton we'll talk about today, those all need solar energies to those all need solar energy to drive the reactions that create hydrocarbons. And when the asteroid that ultimately killed most dinosaurs hit, it threw up enough dust to significantly reduce the amount of solar radiation that was actually reaching Earth's surface. And that dust stayed in there for quite a while. It reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface for quite a while. And reduced photosynthesis came as a result of this. There wasn't energy available for photosynthesis. And no photosynthesis means lots of dead plants. Lots of dead plants means lots of dead heterotrophs, aka the herbivorous dinosaurs, which ate the plants, and then the carnivorous dinosaurs, which ate the herbivorous dinosaurs. And really, a lot of the organisms that survived were kind of opportunists that could just kind of eat detritus or hibernate or eat insects for a little bit. And at the dinosaur extinction, the only organisms that really would have not been heavily affected were those living in places like black smokers, where you have a handful of bacteria and archaea performing what's called chemosynthesis, reactions with inorganic chemical reactions involving iron or sulfur. This is exactly what goes on at Blood Falls, in fact. And those are some of the only biotic communities on Earth that don't rely on the sun's energy at all. Most of them mostly involve simple organisms, but the cool thing about black smokers is that there's enough energy produced at black smokers for there to be these large mats of bacteria and these large tube worms, as well as blind crabs and deep sea fish can feed on the bacteria. So there is actually a fairly complex ecosystem at black smokers that depends on chemosynthesis, which is why people study them as a potential example of, could there be life on, say, the planet Europa, or excuse me, the moon Europa? It's one of Jupiter's moons that some people think might have an ocean underneath the surface. But who knows how much chemosynthesis is going on Europa, and there's not much happening on Earth. It's a few interesting but small scale examples. For the most part, the amount of food available is going to depend on the solar radiation, and the amount of food produced is fundamentally what primary productivity is. It's the amount of food available in the system of sorts, the ecosystem, and that amount of food available depends on how much food the autotrophs are producing. So there's a way to measure it. It's the amount of organic material for a given area or ecosystem that's being synthesized by photosynthesis. And it determines how much starting nutrition there is available for other organisms. And it's going to be dependent on factors such as how readily sunlight is available, how much solar radiation is reaching the surface of the Earth where that ecosystem is to begin with. So I bring that up because Antarctica, we're at a pretty high latitude and we don't get much direct solar radiation. But at the same time, we in Antarctica have 24-hour daylight for part of the year. So that actually ends up, as we'll see, affecting what times of year food gets produced in Antarctica and how heavily. But other factors can be nutrients present, like metals. Plants need nutrients like metals and vitamins to survive. They usually get that from the soil, actually. But in the ocean, that's just going to be present floating in the water. And these are the nutrients I talk about when I've referred to, say, Antarctic bottom water being rich in nutrients. But primary productivity is going to be measured as a unit of grams of carbon, usually calculated from plant biomass, produced per unit area per unit time. So you can get primary productivity of a kelp forest, for example, from kelp, or a grassland dominated by a particular species of grass from measuring the biomass of the grass. And it's, excuse me, it's going to determine how much biodiversity there is to a big degree, because high primary productivity means that there is a rich food web that can be supported. So any food web is going to be dependent on the primary productivity of whatever the autotrophs are, whether it's grasses or trees on land or phytoplankton in the ocean. And we'll talk about what exactly phytoplankton are next. But they are the microscopic and usually single-celled photosynthetic organisms that live in seawater. And amazingly, the survival of even the largest whales in the ocean is dependent on the existence of these tiny plankton, which is really cool. And the relationship between an organism and an organism that either eats it or that it eats is called a trophic relation. Again, from the term troph, which shows up in heterotroph and autotroph. The trophic relation is going to be that between the animal preyed upon and the predator and the animal it preys upon, or between a plant and the animal that grazes on it. Those are all examples of trophic relationships. And you can use a single food chain or pyramid to simplify, but if you're going to accurately and extensively display the various trophic relations in an ecosystem, a food web is usually a lot more useful because, as it turns out, most organisms can be said to feed at different trophic levels. For example, some organisms, like a pig is considered omnivorous because it'll eat lots of different things. It might scavenge, it'll browse on plants, it'll sometimes even hunt small animals, and it'll eat garbage. And so a pig is a really good example of an animal that feeds at multiple trophic levels. It doesn't just eat one thing. And that's true of a lot of the animals in this Antarctic food web that you can see. A good example is how the leopard seal feeds at several levels. The leopard seal, so everything begins with the phytoplankton, which are the photosynthetic organisms, and they're mostly fed upon by krill as well as some other plankton that are animals, zooplankton, and I'll talk more about what that is coming up next. But so the krill get eaten by the leopard seal, but the leopard seal also eats fish that eat the krill. So the leopard seal is feeding at multiple trophic levels, and the leopard seal itself is preyed on by the orca. Now, if you want to follow what happens, if you want to kind of follow how energy transfers up the food chain, you can just pick a starting point and follow where the arrows go. Where the arrows go shows what animal is going to eat which animal next. And something you want to consider is that in an ocean food web, the herbivores are tiny. There's not a lot of larger plants. They're all microscopic. And so the herbivores also tend to be microscopic. Both the plants, so to speak, and the herbivores tend to be plankton. And plankton is a term that refers to an organism's lifestyle, actually. It's not an evolutionary term. It's not a term that refers to what animals are related to which animals. It refers to animals that live in the open ocean but can't really swim on their own. A plankton drifts with the current and can't really freely swim against it to any degree. So fish, which can swim against currents, are considered to be nectonic organisms. So most larger swimming organisms are considered not plankton, but jellyfish are actually. Even though jellyfish are enormous, they are not really able to swim against the current much, and so they're considered to be plankton. The vast majority of plankton, though, are tiny and often microscopic. And they can be any type of organism. They can be photosynthetic organisms, kind of like plants, but they're not technically plants. But basically, yes, they can be little algae. Algae is a way to put it, even though that term is kind of broad. Or they can be animals. They can be tiny crustaceans, like krill are an example of what are called zooplankton or animal plankton, plankton that don't photosynthesize, plankton that have to graze on other plankton to survive. So actually, Sheldon plankton from SpongeBob is a copepod, which they do actually have one eye, and they are also related to crabs and to krill. But they're an example of zooplankton because they have to eat phytoplankton to survive. You also have examples of little worms, little snails. You also have a lot of larvae. A lot of the young of snails and corals and crabs and even fish in some cases exist as plankton when they're really tiny, like when they've just hatched out of their eggs in the very early stages of their lives. And so a single drop of seawater is full of a myriad of these things. There in particular are just going to be so many little phytoplankton that you can't see, but there's tons of them even in a single drop of seawater. Really, phytoplankton are kind of amazing. They're very much the plants of the ocean and the breadbasket of the ocean in the sense of being where the food comes from. And they're microscopic, but collectively they make up most of the biomass in the ocean at any given time. There's just tons and tons of them, but they're just microscopic and spread out. But biomass is, again, it's useful to measure primary productivity because it's essentially how much plant material is being made is a pretty good proxy for how much food is there available to begin with. And you can also use biodiversity. You can also use biomass as a proxy for biodiversity, or at least they're correlated in that you're going to have a more abundant and more diverse life if there's more food to begin with. And speaking of diversity, phytoplankton are, in terms of their evolution, extremely diverse. They are not plants, and few of them are even all that closely related to one another. They are simply grouped together because they photosynthesize, the same way that krill and copepods and snail larvae are all considered zooplankton because they eat phytoplankton. But the thing is, most zooplankton are actually animals, whereas phytoplankton are all about as different from one another as animals are from fungi, quite honestly. And they're not plants either. Most of them are as different from plants, actually, as animals are from fungi, again. So we have diatoms and dinoflagellates and foraminifera, and they're all extremely different phylogenetically. And phylogenetically refers to how something is classified as a living organism based on what we have of its DNA, based on fossil evidence, based on body type studies, etc. And you don't need to memorize all of these, but hopefully you get some appreciation, even just looking at all of the different shapes of phytoplankton. These are all kind of what they look like close up. They look really different. They're really pretty. They have these glassy appearances, and they have shells. Their cells have calcium carbonate in them, or silica in some cases, which is why they have kind of a glassy appearance. But they're also different, and there's a much bigger diversity of what type of organism is photosynthesizing in the ocean than there is on land. Because on land, it's mostly just plants, and land plants are all actually pretty closely related to one another. Out in the ocean, even though you can't see the autotrophs, the producers, there's just so many different types of them, and they're all really so very different. But let's simplify a little bit and talk about trophic levels and energy pyramids. So if you take a single linear example, like if you follow one of the arrows on the food web a couple of slides ago, you start out at the lowest trophic level, or level in the food chain, the bottom of the food chain essentially, and that's where the producers are actually making the food. Those are the producers on land. Those would be plants most of the time. And one trophic level above that, you have the herbivores, or sometimes people call them first level consumers, but let's just say herbivores. And in the ocean, that's going to be krill and other zooplankton. They're going to be really tiny, and frankly, most life that you can see in the ocean is carnivorous. Most life in the ocean that you can actually see is probably at least feeding on the zooplankton. For example, whales and fish feeding on krill. Even the meat eats meat in the ocean, which I find kind of amusing. So the primary carnivores, the first level of organisms that wants to eat the krill and the other zooplankton, you're going to actually have a lot of fish for one thing, but you're also going to have some larger animals like whales, blue whales and minke whales and other whales that use baleen to filter out plankton are actually going to be considered primary carnivores, even though they're enormous. And wouldn't think of them that way necessarily. You wouldn't think of them as being kind of like bottom feeders essentially, but they are. They're eating herbivores. They're just filtering all the tiny herbivores out of the water, which is kind of interesting. And we'll talk more about baleen whales going forward. But if humans, when humans hunted whales, that technically made us the secondary carnivores because we were eating meat that ate meat. That's completely setting aside whether humans should have been eating whales or not. But most whales don't have natural predators. Now, if you have fish or seals, that are eating the krill, then the fish are going to be preyed on by penguins as well as other seals. The seals get eaten by orcas mostly, and by leopard seals. Leopard seals eat other seals. But so you go up and up, and you have primary carnivores and secondary carnivores, and in some cases tertiary carnivores, like the orca, which eats the leopard seal, which eats fish, which eats krill. Actually, one thing I will say is that it's a sign of how productive it's a sign of how productive the Antarctic marine ecosystem actually is that we have tertiary carnivores like orca, because as it turns out, carnivory is not that efficient an energy transfer method, because when something eats something else, only 10% of that energy is actually transferred. So when solar energy reaches the Earth, and you got to remember then that the solar energy reaching the Earth is a pretty small percentage of what the sun is putting out to begin with, plants can only use a small portion of that to make food. There's a lot of waste and energy lost there's a lot of energy loss and just waste in photosynthesis, and in eating a plant, there is also a lot of waste and inefficiency. When krill eat phytoplankton, or when a human eats an apple, at most 10% of the energy stored in that bit of plant matter, and probably less than that, is actually going to be successfully converted into energy for the consuming organism to actually use. So 10% of energy at most gets transferred from trophic level to trophic level. So if a whale eats krill that ate phytoplankton, there's only actually 1% of the energy reaching the whale. The phytoplankton can use 10% of the energy available to it. Well, actually, so from the perspective of, let's say, the phytoplankton. So the krill eats the phytoplankton and gets 10% of that starting energy. Then the whale eats the krill and gets 10% of the available energy in the krill. That means that the whale is only getting 1% of the energy that was initially harvested from whatever that the phytoplankton made. The phytoplankton actually made a lot of energy, but the krill couldn't use much of that, and the whale which ate the krill really couldn't use much of that. It only got 1% of the energy. So basically, there's a lot of energy available in plants, relatively speaking, but a lot of it gets lost as you go further and further and up the food chain. The farther away you get from plants, the less of the energy produced by those plants you are getting. Now, there are reasons for animals to eat meat. The top predators have evolved to rely on a lot of protein, essentially, but there's not going to be a lot of them. There are not going to be tons of orcas or leopard seals, and in fact, relatively speaking, seeing this many orcas is kind of a rare sighting. They do hang out in pods, but relatively speaking, by the numbers, there's a lot more phytoplankton than there are orcas in the world. There's millions of phytoplankton in a drop of water. I don't know how many orcas there are, but there's not millions of orcas in the Antarctic waters. There's definitely fewer than that. So this is why carnivores have to eat so much meat to survive, and why even on land there's not going to be a lot of top predators like lions or wolves. The interesting thing actually is that that's one reason that orcas do feed at multiple trophic levels. They will eat lower on the food chain sometimes. They won't just eat leopard seals. They'll also eat fish, and that is slightly more energy efficient. It's one reason why it's kind of like how it's not efficient to only eat meat, or only eat meat that also ate meat. This is why humans don't hunt. This is one reason why humans don't eat carnivorous animals much, although them not being very abundant in the first place has a lot to do with that also. So let's talk about how productivity manifests in the Antarctic, because I mentioned that there are a lot of secondary and tertiary carnivores living in Antarctica. So there must be a lot of productivity somehow, but Antarctica doesn't seem like that great a place. for producing a lot of plant matter. In the ocean, it actually is. So the fact that Antarctica is in darkness for so much of the year creates a really interesting effect when the sunlight does return. So photosynthesis in the Southern Ocean just grinds to a halt for the winter, and the autotrophs, the phytoplankton, lie completely dormant. So nutrients that would normally be used up accumulate in the water. And actually, even setting this aside, year-round, Antarctic waters are rich in nutrients because there is an equivalent to Antarctic bottom water that is coming from the Arctic that is actually upwelling near the Antarctic. The water mass known as North Atlantic deep water shows up near Antarctica, and it brings nutrients. So Antarctic waters, all things considered, are actually quite rich in nutrients because of thermohaline circulation causing water to upwell there and bringing nutrients with it. But during the winter, that just is allowed to build up because the plants just are not using it at all. There's no photosynthesis. The interesting thing that happens is that when the sunlight returns, the phytoplankton that have been living dormant in the sea ice, they just go into overdrive and there is a boom in productivity. The biomass of phytoplankton skyrockets, and immediately after, the biomass of krill and of other zooplankton skyrockets also. And that brings, for example, the whales that come to Antarctica to take advantage of the boom of productivity. In fact, that's a big reason why whales migrate. Humpback whales, in particular, are an example of a whale species that lives off krill. They're one of the baleen whales that filters krill out of the water. So they feed in Antarctica during the summer when food is plentiful and there's just krill everywhere. And then in the winter, when it gets dark again and there's no food available, they're on their way to their breeding grounds in more equatorial latitudes where they can rear their young. And the whales that we see in California are actually undertaking a similar journey. Humpback whales live in all of the world's oceans, and there's a population that breeds close to the equator, but then migrates to Alaska, the waters around Alaska. And the whales that we see going up and down the coast along California are making that migration. So not everything in Antarctica migrates to obtain this food, but a pattern you'll see is that a lot of the marine organisms either kind of go into a period of dormancy during the winter or they migrate elsewhere. That's why you can see whales in Antarctica for, well, only during the summer, and that's why, lucky for us, because that's when people would even consider going to Antarctica. But the sea ice actually also plays a really interesting role with Antarctic food webs, because I mentioned that phytoplankton go dormant, and during the winter, they either stay frozen in the sea ice, they just get trapped in the water when it freezes, or they kind of lie dormant on the underside of it. And yes, phytoplankton can be dormant for long periods. Kind of suspended animation is basically how you want to think of it. But this is actually really beneficial for krill, because krill are growing kind of under the ice. The ice actually kind of serves as a nursery for young krill. They don't have any food because there's no photosynthesis, but then there's actually the phytoplankton frozen in the ice or living or kind of lying dormant on the undersides. And so the krill can graze on that and survive the winter. The krill have that food source that is the algae, the phytoplankton that's there because the sea ice is there. And something we'll talk about during the climate change part of the course is that krill populations have actually plummeted with sea ice coverage becoming a lot less. And that has potentially really bad consequences for the Antarctic food web because most things that live in Antarctica depend on krill really heavily. But anyhow, the cool thing is that when the water melts, that releases the phytoplankton and it creates the boom that I mentioned in the last slide. And then that basically means that the krill growing in this nursery, they have this sudden food source available to them, and that leads to them having a population boom right after. So it's really interesting how the life cycles of some of the lower down the food chain but really important organisms like phytoplankton and krill, their life cycles have evolved to move around the sea ice. And in fact, that is something we'll see with penguins and some other larger organisms too. Penguin breeding is very heavily dependent on ice to a big extent. Now, the last thing I'll mention in this half of the lecture is something we'll barely get to touch on, but there's a lot of really interesting marine life in Antarctica. And there is a way to categorize marine life by whether it lives in the open water or on the seafloor. So those that live in the open water, whether it's plankton or whether it's nectonic organisms, aka fish and other organisms that can swim, those are pelagic. And the way I remember that is that the word pelagic makes me think of pelicans, and pelicans feed out in the open water. They like to eat open water fish, pelagic fish. Um, Benthic organisms are those that live on the sea floor, the sea bottom, and those include corals and sea stars and crabs. And the benthic organisms in Antarctica are really interesting. There are lots of giant sea stars and crabs. A lot of them are blind because they only see they see darkness so much of the year, or they live under ice shelves that are going to block out a lot of the sunlight. They also tend to be enormous. The gigantism is probably an adaptation to the cold water. And the second half of this lecture will walk you through some more of the marine organisms, not so much the benthic community because we don't have a lot of time for that. I will say that there is a clip of Encounters at the End of the World I'm having you watch later in the term, and I don't know if it's going to be I don't think it's going to show it in the clip that I have you watch, but elsewhere in the movie, there is some really beautiful footage of just underwater scenery from Antarctica. Pictures of all the sea stars and all the other benthic organisms living on the seafloor. So you can find that on GauchoCast, but either way, I will see you for the second half of this lecture after whatever break you take.